here back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. For many years now, I've been following the work of Project Censored. And if you don't, I recommend that you do. Project Censored covers the stories that either are not being reported in the mainstream press or are being underreported, suppressed, overlooked, mislaid, and otherwise not made available for wide public consumption. Joining me now is Mickey Huff. Mickey Huff is the director of Project Censored. He's also the president of the Media Freedom Foundation. He, to date, this says right here in front of me, he has co-edited 14 volumes of Project Censored's annual book and contributed numerous chapters to that book. That book, which has just been, this year's edition has just been released, is entitled Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2023, the top censored stories and media analysis of 21-22. It was edited by Mickey and Andy Lee Roth along with Project Censored, and he joins us now. So Mickey Huff, first of all, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks so much, Richard. It's an honor to be invited, and we appreciate the opportunity to discuss the state of our so-called free press.
Yes, exactly, precisely. And let's start with that, just real general, if you don't mind. Americans, this society has a long-standing tradition of performatively admiring the hard-hitting journalist. You know, I'm thinking of all those 1930s and 40s movies of the guy in the fedora who goes up against the mob in City Hall and doesn't care who roughs him up. He's going to get the story to the people. This is a classic American hero, a kind of mythology that was resurrected somewhat after Watergate with Woodward and Bernstein. So we could do the whole segment on Woodward. We won't. But what I'm getting at, as I'm sure you know, is that we idealize the hard-hitting journalist who stands alone and lonely in the pursuit of truth. But actually, as a society, we neglect that person at best. Sometimes we hound them into oblivion. There are a lot of people whose stories end unhappily because they stand up and tell the truth, or there is the quiet death of, I forget what the latest terminology is from Elon Musk, but amplification. People have freedom of speech, but not of amplification.
Not freedom of reach. Yeah. Not
freedom of speech, reach. Thank you. So that makes your work at Project Censored ever more important. It continued to be important, increasingly important, I would say. And B, I don't have a B, actually. What do you think?
Well, we can go B, C, D, E, F, G the whole way through. There's so many examples of what you just described. And unfortunately, I'm in agreement with you about everything you just said. In fact, you set it up wonderfully historically. I'm also an historian of media and censorship. And, you know, we like to go back and look in the past because the past offers context. And it really, if you look hard enough, it offers very obvious clues as to how we ended up where we now are. And when you say that we live in an era where something like Project Censored seems to be more needed or more relevant than when we were founded in 1976 in the alleged heyday of Woodward and Bernstein, right, the aftermath of Watergate, some people scratch their head and they say, wait a minute, we've had cable, we've had the internet, we've got social media, we've got information at the click of a finger, like on the button, on the gadgets. What do you mean censorship? So it's really important, Richard, that we talk about that chronology of censorship and what we mean. In the United States, people most often, when they think about censorship, they kind of do also think in black and white or binary terms, just kind of like how we go back and lionize or make heroic the intrepid journalist that stands up to City Hall. The reality is that we like to throw those people under the bus, right? Whether it's Gary Webb or Michael Hastings, right, or Julian Assange. In the real world, people that do those things sometimes don't fare as well as a Woodward or a Bernstein. And even that's a great example, because Project Censored literally was founded out of Watergate. Carl Jensen founded Project Censored at Sonoma State University in 1976. And what he did was he went back. He figured he counted himself as a savvy news person, sociology and communications. He studied media, came from media, and a background in media and journalism and advertising. And he was curious as to the trajectory and the timeline of the Watergate scandal itself, and how it happened before the 72 election, and the independent alternative press had been poking around and covering a whole sort of Nixon's corruption and crimes and so forth. And the corporate press, the legacy press, the establishment media, they did eventually glom onto it, but they didn't pick it up, and it didn't gain steam until into Nixon's second term. And so what Carl Jensen asked was a simple question that became the genesis of Project Censored about the definition of censorship. And he said, look, the story of Watergate basically came out, not all of it, and some of it came out later, and that's another show entirely, what that really was and wasn't, and what Woodward and Bernstein did and didn't do.
Right.
But the bigger picture was that Jensen said, how is it that a lot of these stories don't get picked up in a timely enough fashion, or which ones don't get picked up at all, right? And so he used the Watergate moment as one to start a research project called Project Censored, teaching critical media literacy education before there was even a phrase for it. He was teaching news literacy at a time when they didn't necessarily think about news literacy. They had Walter Cronkite, they had the three networks, they had the major papers. People generally kind of trusted media. And Watergate was sort of like allegedly that feather back in the fedora cap, right? See that if we let the system work, it routes out its corruption, and the media uncovered it, and the Fourth Estate came and rescued the day. Yeah, there's a lot of other stories underneath that maybe undermine that myth. But the myth is what's so important that came out of that. And that's what Jensen he championed. On one sense, he was critical of the delays and the lack of coverage. But on the other, he affirmed the power and the role of media and the importance of the free press. Now, this gets into the complicated definition of censorship. Censorship, technically, according to Carl Jensen and according to us at Project Censored, even 40-some years later, is that censorship is actually anything that interferes with the free flow of information in a society that purports to have a free press structure or system. In other words, it's not only government interference or prior restraint that counts as censorship in the literal sense. Now, it may be the legal sense constitutionally in the United States. However, the spirit of the First Amendment clearly indicates that censorship is problematic for the democratic process and for people that purport to live in a self-governing society. Therefore, we talk a lot more, and nowadays this is everywhere, censorship by proxy.
Right.
Corporate censorship, private entity censorship is rampant. But Americans have a hard time wrapping their heads around it, because Americans also have this sensibility of, well, this is a free market. It's a business enterprise. These are proprietary algorithms. These are things that they can choose to do or not do. Well, guess what? That is not unlike what editors said to Carl Jensen at the founding of Project Censored. When they said they didn't censor, they said they used news judgment. Well, some of that news judgment came all the way from the White House. In the case of Nixon and Cronkite, the Nixon White House actually did interfere with Walter Cronkite's coverage of Watergate, and they did spike some CBS reports on Watergate before it came and kept boiling to the head in the Washington Post series. And I would argue, more importantly, that came out of the Washington Post series was Carl Bernstein's 1977 piece in Rolling Stone on Operation Mockingbird, and 400 reporters, he only reported on some of them, that were actually working for the CIA as propagandists and censors in America's newsrooms. That story basically got nowhere, while Woodward catapulted himself to prominence as an establishment insider that could then approve of certain scandals and certain narratives, and then anything that doesn't get its attention, well, that just doesn't matter. And in and of itself, that's a de facto culture and frame of censorship that's been very interesting and important to us at Project Censored for over 40 years. And if you look at today's kinds of censorship, while there clearly is government interference, government censorship, government colluding with social media companies, defense companies, national security state, interfering with these DARPA companies that came out of the 1950s and 60s, right? Because there's a two-way street there. People need to really look behind that curtain. I know one of the images you have in your program is going back to the Wizard of Oz, right? And who's pulling the wires of the public mind. Well, in this case, it's many of these actors that are not allowing certain stories to get out to the public. And what we do at Project Censored is we survey the independent press, the alternative media, and we look for stories that the corporate or legacy media either miss entirely, bury, or wildly distort if they do cover it at all. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the history of where we are with that issue.
And, before we get into some of the stories, I do think it's important, excuse me, I do think it's important to address something, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, since this show, as radio, is broadcast on a lot of what are considered, Democratic Party-leaning radio stations, liberal stations, and so on. What strikes me about this conversation about the need for media transparency and the need to shine the light in dark corners is, I'm not going to address the far right on this one because that's not my audience, is to me, the striking absence or even sometimes the animosity of certain liberal forces and voices calling to have these stories be revealed. For example, Mickey, just looking at the blurbs for this latest State of the Media report you guys have put out, it's a lot of friends of my program and friends of mine, but I don't see a lot of people, let's say, from the Democratic Party or the current mainstream media, or in fact, what I see out there a lot is outside your report and in the world in general, is a robust enthusiasm in recent years for suppressing certain stories. And I mean, to me, this goes back to what I thought was an overhyped story of Russiagate, so-called.
Absolutely.
I had somebody say to me very early on, you're a Russia skeptic. And I said, I'm an everything skeptic. I'm in journalism. That's the job, right? The fact that the CIA, head of the CIA or whomever tells you something's happening does not mean it's happening. It means you investigate whether it's true or not. And when you investigate and you don't see evidence, you doubt. That's the job. But it seems to me there is increasing zest for suppressing stories that are uncomfortable, and the Russia media thing, which I think was extremely overblown. I liked the meme of Russia put out supposedly of Jesus arm wrestling with the devil because I thought Jesus looked like Cat Stevens. But the notion that even if it hurts, quote unquote, our side, if you have a side of that kind, the notion that the truth is, I don't mean to sound corny, but a sacred trust. That seems, I don't find anybody fighting for that except like you guys and a few other folks.
Well, we're in that corner. That's, quote, our side right there, which means as natural skeptics, not cynics.
Right.
Skeptics, there's a difference, right? A lot of what we see in social media particularly is just cynicism, knee-jerk cynicism. The New York Times, why are you posting that? The New York Times is a propaganda arm of the yada, yada, yada. Sure, but not all the time. Just like Fox News isn't wrong all the time. And this is, again, and I'm going to do a real quick nod to your audience here and talk about, there's a lot of censorship. There's a lot of calls for cancellation. There's a lot of calls for book bans. There's a lot of calls to censor and control information coming from the right, from the far right.
Right.
No question.
No question.
There always is. But there often is also calls for something similar coming from the left. They just wrap it in a sense of establishment institutional legitimacy that has since collapsed in the public sector. Public trust in these institutions has collapsed for good reason, because they have been shown to lack transparency, lack accountability, and lack ethical and moral behavior in the public interest, whether it's Congress.
And you're talking about, excuse me for interrupting, Mickey, but by these institutions, you mean big media
all
institutions.
Of it, the Fourth Estate, the Congress, our government in general. There has been a civic collapse in the last 50 years, brought on in many cases by neoliberalism, which is cheerled by many corporate Democrats and centrists. people that 20, 30 years ago would have been moderate Republicans are now considered centrist Democrats. Like that shifting baseline from Clinton onward keeps going. And so that people, even people that in European society that would be considered centrist or even modestly conservative, like a Bernie Sanders, are, seen as like Trotsky or something over here in the United States. That's how skewed it is. But that's the function of corporate media, by the way, is to frame that discussion such that we can winnow out any kind of legitimate criticism. The kind of criticism that Ralph Nader was doing 50 years ago now sounds kind of like from outer space, right? The basic trend of holding accountable companies, businesses, government, et cetera, to operate transparently and honestly in the public interest, right? So here we are still talking about it, right? In other words, we haven't changed that focus. Everything else has shifted out from under us. So when we talk about censorship now, and in the new book, we talk about this a lot, what we talk about is liberals have taken the mantle of censoring alleged disinformation in the name of public good. So the whole moral panic over fake news coming out of the 2016 election, where the Democrats weaponized the whole Russiagate scenario and just ran with it. Very few people in the corporate media bother to fact check any of that stuff, right? And they just keep running with it and running with it and running with it, not realizing historically how bad it looks for them, right? And this is, of course, why people are so Pavlovian in their support of what's happening with sending $100 billion to Ukraine is Russia's bad. They've been bad since 1918, 17. They were bad again in the Cold War. And then after we manipulated their elections with Yeltsin, things got off the rails with Putin, and now things are bad again. And Russia's responsible for election meddling. Russians responsible. You fill in the blank. By the way, we go way out of our way to talk about problems in Russia, problems with Putin, problems with Russian media, problems with discrimination in Russia. Because we criticize these other issues that are going on in the world does not automatically put us in a camp of Putin or Trump.
Right, of course.
Well, characters.
We've all had to, all of those who have tried to discuss it have faced that same accusation. But look, and by the way, you use the phrase moral panic. Like I wrote a piece called Russiagate as Moral Panic. Yeah. I went back to Stanley Cohen, who is the sociologist who came up with the term moral panic. It was classic. It was kind of when the world shifts, around you in a way that makes you uncomfortable. You look for solutions, and there are moral entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs who come in and guide that fear in a certain direction. Not to say that, Russia, and Putin, haven't done a lot of bad things, but the notion that, I don't want to focus on it too much, except in the sense that I'm on this mission to make people understand. I guess I hate fake news. Mm-hmm. I hate right-wing fake news. I think it's terrible, devastating, horrible in a small way. I've been on the receiving end of it early on. It was very distressing, I was accused of calling for a denial of service attack against the right, which was a distortion of some words I used. And believe me, it was unpleasant, the hate mail, So I'm against fake news. But I think, the moral of what you're saying, Mickey, is that if you really want to fight fake news, then be a source of trustworthy news. Because, right? I mean, I'll stop talking.
No, man, Richard, 100%. I'm agreeing with everything you're saying. And the same things have happened to us. And particularly since, the kind of stories that we unearth at Project Censored are critical of the power structure and the establishment, they do tend to skew progressive, left, maybe libertarian on the right end of the spectrum, suspicion of concentrated power, right? So that shouldn't be surprised because, one of the big themes in our book this year is the state of the so-called free billionaire press, right? We look at how many there's just a gobbling up. It's Ben Bigdickian's media monopoly on steroids from big tech to corporate media. There are fewer and fewer companies that own more and more of all the things that we see, read, hear. And in the name of curating fake news in the moral panic, many liberals have tried to use social media as it's a Trojan horse for censorship, plain and simple. But because they paint it as we know what's best and we are the ones that will fact check this, take a look at Facebook. Who are some of the Facebook fact checkers? None other than the Atlantic Council, the PR wing of NATO. Right? Hardly an objective observer, right? And so this is the problem. The fake news meme gave us all of this room to say, we can't tolerate propaganda. We can't tolerate fake news. Okay, then let's not tolerate it at all. No matter where it comes from, no matter what the facts will tell us at the end, we've got to go back to society professional journalists' basic code of ethics. We've got to follow the facts where they lead. We've got to try to minimize harm. We've got to have transparent sources. And again, at Project Censored, we criticize the corporate media and the so-called mainstream establishment press, but we also affirm the role that media play in our society and the importance of a free press. And guess what? We also point out when the Washington Post does a blockbuster story, we applaud them. When the New York Times does an amazing investigative report because they've got the resources like nobody's business to do it, we applaud that. And we simply say, we would like to see more of that. And on a slow news day, as Ralph Nader would like to say, Nader says, pick up a copy of the Project Censored book and start leafing through the top stories because it's likely that you guys haven't covered them at all. Right? They miss things just like we all do. And so, and this goes back to the founding of the project. People saw us as media critics, but they saw criticism in a negative way. And I want to play with that the same way we played with cynicism and skepticism. Media criticism doesn't have to be negative. It can be constructive. We try to point out the stories that we fact check them. They're vetted. We teach students how to become media literate in the process of researching these stories. We have 30 expert judges that vet them for accuracy, and they go through multiple layers before they ever end up on our ballot or ever end up in our book every year. You can see the stories for free at projectcensored.org. But the point is that we want to showcase the kind of journalism that you were just talking about moments ago, Richard, the kind of journalism that's required. And look, I understand that, but the liberal class don't like when we call attention to their collusion with what we call the FANGs, right? That's the Facebook, Meta, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, Alphabet stuff, right? The big tech sector. It's been shown over and over again that there's been collusion. There's been algorithmic censorship. We've written about the new gatekeepers as algorithmic forms of censorship that can run the gamut from right to left. The real danger for all of this isn't only that it's happening. It's that people either deny it, don't understand it, or think it only works one way. The real way it works is the controllers and the owners of these platforms end up the winners. We, the public, end up the losers. Even if we think we win one of the battles here or there, the local school board pushing back against the anti-woke law in Florida, all things to applaud. But the bigger war is an information war. And if we don't become critically media literate and we don't become actively engaged in getting our own accurate information and sharing it and vetting it and trying to help other people elevate what they think about when they think of a free press, then we're not going to be making much headway in this very protracted, long-ranging conflict. And it's getting more and more difficult to figure out with AI, and it's getting more and more difficult still. People can't wrap their head around the censorship by proxy. Even with Elon Musk and Twitter, people are like, it's his platform now. When then did we allow the entire corporate conglomerate, national security, military, industrial, national security complex to subsume and capture the entirety of the public square, Richard? Right.
And I can't tell you how many times I've written about that, including I was knocked off Twitter for 8 months under the old regime. Yeah. And whenever that happens to somebody, it's always with great sort of self-satisfaction. Well, it's a private company. They can do what they want. It's not a free speech issue. Yeah. And that's the wrong answer. But Mickey, let's talk about some of the stories you guys included in this year's anthology. I'll just run through some of the headlines. Maybe we can focus on them. Top, not in detail, but just what the pattern tells us. Okay. Fossil fuel industry subsidized at a rate of $11 million per minute. I think that's something most people don't know. Wage theft. U.S. businesses suffer few consequences for stealing millions from workers every year. EPA withheld reports, and at least 128 members of Congress invested in the fossil fuel industry.
Which connects to the first story, right? How do you think that these companies have $11 million a minute coming in? Well, that's because you've got 128 members of Congress that are also invested. These are all the revolving door. Notice we're back into the power structure, the ownership structure, the political economy of and what's happening behind the scenes, as it were. And those are the dots. And by the way, it's not just the billionaire press that we're talking about. It's billionaire culture. It's the culture of wealth that Peter Phillips decried in his book Giants, The Global Power Elite, the former director of Project Censored, the political sociologist, who talks about how these major investment firms, hedge fund firms, they're buying up newspapers. They're buying them up and shutting them down. They're turning them into just aggregates of top-down managed news propaganda and public relations firms. And Bill Gates himself, one of the top stories, Richard, Bill Gates himself and the Gates Foundation gave $319 million to news outlets around the world. I mean, this is direct money influencing coverage of anything from pandemic response to who owns the media and influences it itself. Another one of the stories is the CIA plans to kill Julian Assange. The CIA had open plans to kidnap and assassinate Julian Assange, right? I mean, the idea that somehow they will extradite him and he has a chance in hell of getting any kind of fair trial in the United States under the Espionage Act is ludicrous fantasy. But most people don't want to go back. They want to dissect it and say, oh, but Assange did this and Assange did that. Most people don't know what Assange did and didn't do because they never followed the case. And the U.S. tipped against him because of the fervor behind Russiagate and the insanity of the 2016 election. But if you go back over a decade, the Democratic Party and liberals used to lionize people like Manning and WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. It's only when he began to release other leaks that showed how all the rot went across the political spectrum that people developed this strong distaste for him all of a sudden. And then they play the game they always play, Richard, shoot the messenger, right?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Or torture the messenger and then shoot him. Yeah. And, that's why, we could go on and on about, Chris Hedges and what he's been through and, other people, what they've been through. I was blackballed from MSNBC when Obama came in. I'm not sure why exactly. People would ask me why I go on RT, which I used to do. Well, yeah, nobody else is wants to hear what I have to say. Let's say here's another one that's kind of interesting, Mickey. That you got corporate consolidation causing record inflation in food prices. Now, my newspapers and my cable news has been telling me basically that there's an inflation problem, possibly easing, but we've been struggling with inflation because working people are making too much money, even though wages are not increasing as quickly as prices or costs. So, but nevertheless, they're lagging behind, but still we got to do something to make sure working people hurt more. Even with the good news on inflation, they raise the interest rates again. It's important that people understand that. And, I alwait's wonder with the media, especially covering something like inflation, to what extent it's top-down censorship or control of the media, and to what extent it's what I think either Disraeli or Gore Vidal or both called a conspiracy of shared values, where they just all listen to each other. And
as George Carlin once quipped, it's a big club and you ain't in it. Or we aren't.
It's a big club,
right?
Right.
And so, but this is the kind
inflation's a perfect example. When do people hear that corporate profits are 53% of profit taking is 53% of costing of price increases? Who tells them?
Take a look at the same corporate media that tells us that we're making too much money is the same corporate media that's reporting record profits in the corporate sector across the spectrum. How can there be both, Richard? I mean, just a commonsensical analysis, right? This is kind of like a middle school critical thinking, exercise here. It's like, how is it that, let's take the oil company, and if not that, this one was about food, right? Kroger, trying to buy up more. Food and Water Watch covered this. Common Dreams covered this. American Prospect covered this. So in other words, there's stuff to cover. There's plenty of analysis, perspective, and facts that show that this is price gouging on almost every level.
Right.
Under the cover of the pandemic, right? And you were doing so well under the pandemic, Richard, with that free government money. And corporations just have to keep up. And then the supply chain, that's all wrecked. And so they've got plenty of excuses. But let's just simply go back to, Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky in 1988 with their propaganda model is still very useful 30 some years later, right? Who owns the media? How do the advertisers all work symbiotically with each other? How do they rely on elite sourcing from those in government and corporate offices so they maintain their power by controlling the narrative? Of course, we can have a false right-left paradigm and have a he said, she said, yes, no, up, down on certain issues, but we never really ask the most critical questions, not about right-left, but top-bottom. And this inflation question is a total top-bottom question. Who controls these measures? Who has a say in them? What is Congress, if anything, doing about any of this stuff? Where is the antitrust legislation? We had more robust antitrust legislation 120 years ago than we'd ever have now. From the publishing industry to the food industry to the tech industry, where in the world now are the Teddy Roosevelts, right? Where are the Fighting Bob La Follett's? Right. Republicans, by the way, going back over 100 years. But this story, again, it's a bait and switch, too. And by the way, while the media is telling you about Kroger and why it's good for Kroger to take everything, to buy everything, and it's going to be really convenient for you, you'll then spin through the coupon section and you'll see, well, here's some coupons from Kroger. Again, hide the collusion. Yeah. They didn't even hide the fact that these are actually partners. These are business partners. This is not a separate, there's not a firewall between the news production, the news media, the companies they cover, the Congress they cover, just like there's no firewall between people in Congress invested in fossil fuel companies that then turn the other way as they're subsidized to the tune of $11 million a minute. Just think about that. Let your audience just think about that. Eduardo Garcia's article on this. He's a great writer for Tree Hugger and other environmental causes. $11 million a minute. We don't have money for healthcare. We don't have money for teaching. We don't have money to cancel student debt. We've got $100 billion to send to Ukraine. We've got $11 million a minute to the fossil fuel industry, but we don't have money for your healthcare. I mean, again, it's a real no-brainer. It's a real simple exercise in critical thinking that the corporate media won't cover. But if we actually have a true free press, those outlets, they do cover those stories and they let the public decide how that impacts them.
And here's, this affects both, I don't want to leave the Republicans off the hook, too. It was weird to me. I wrote a piece for the American Prospect. I had a video that was on YouTube. I think only 400 people had looked at it. It was the Republicans on the House Ways and Means Committee explicitly saying how they would cut Social Security if they got Congress by holding the debt ceiling hostage, including saying things like, if the public knew what we were going to do, it would be political suicide, that kind of thing. That story never got covered because there's a narrative they want to protect that says the two parties, there's nothing really to report there except a few differences on cultural issues. And, I criticize the Democrats a lot about a lot of things, but this was a case where one party explicitly laid out what it intends to do, and for some reason that wasn't considered worthy of media. So I would have thought it would have been a front page story.
Yeah, it would be if the corporate press wasn't totally subsumed in a handful of these for-profit entities. It would be. So in other words, you said American Prospect, right? So that's what we do with Project Censored. We look at the alternative, the independent, the non-corporate press. That doesn't imply or mean that it's quote unquote objective. There are no real objective sources. And that was a big ruse that the quote mainstream media has played upon the public for decades. They use those mantras of we report, you decide, fair and balanced, most trusted name in news, all the news that's fit to print, democracy dies in darkness. And Jeff Bezos is turning out the lights at the Washington Post. The New York Times has all the news that fits their print, meaning what's already going to go in. CNN's only the most trusted name in news among the people that they ask. These are ruses played against the public to build trust that have failed miserably, by the way. But the idea that these are outlets that the people think are somehow objective is absurd. But then when they go to these alternative independent outlets that they haven't heard of, they're like, well, they're clearly biased. It's like, well, no, that's the point. The point is that they're not hiding They're factually reporting about what's happening, just like the muckrakers of 100 years ago did. Lincoln Steffens, when he was investigating the corruption of City Hall and corporations and banks, surprisingly, right, he came to the conclusion, like, these people are all working in cahoots to benefit themselves at the public interest. I mean, you can sugarcoat that if you want, Richard, but it says what it says. And that's what real journalism does. It tells the story. As George Seldes in the mid-20th century said, the job of journalism isn't to be objective as an observer. He said, she said, we heard from both sides, even though one of them has no facts to support it. The job of journalism is to tell the public what's really going on. Right. And that means following the facts wherever they go. And today, maybe it goes against your party, maybe, right? Or today, I really thought that I was really in favor of that person and that candidate, but they really have some problems here. We criticized both the major parties equally. We tend to go after the party that's in more control or power because, well, there's the definition of it, right? It doesn't mean we ignore other things. But, when we have Republicans in the White House or Republicans in control of Congress, Project Censored writes a lot of stories about that. And the liberals come on and say, oh, Project Censored's good. They got their groove back. Then when a Democrat gets in office, they're like, they're a bunch of Russophobes. They've turned against us. No, once again, we're back to where we started, Richard. We haven't shifted our baseline. The baseline has been shifted, and there's a tug of war going on beneath. And we think it's important that we set our moral compass to the principles of a free press, to the right of the public to know. We need to unquestionably and unflappably support whistleblowing, whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and all those that not only speak truth to power, but speak truth as power in a democratic republic. And that's why journalism is so important. And that's why we champion and lionize solid, independent, fact-based journalism wherever it comes from, including the recent reporting of the Twitter files coming through people like Matt Taibbi or Barry Weiss or others, right? You'll notice a lot of the liberal establishment has nothing to do with them anymore. Because why? Because they started following stories that went against the party narrative and the liberal line. And yes, Elon Musk can cherry pick, and Elon Musk has problems galore. But that doesn't make those stories less important. We need to be able to look at the facts. We need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to be able to hold cognitive dissonance and allow journalism to work so that our democracy is more functional.
We could do a whole segment on Hunter Biden's laptop.
We sure could.
and I've been horrified since the beginning about the way that story has been censored. I read everything that was available before the election. It did not alter my vote, but whether it did or didn't, if you believe in truth, you believe it. Once you've crossed that line, and I can't tell you, Mickey, how many people I speak to, friends, Democrats, who still have massive misinformation about, they say, well, no, it was tampered with, it was this, it's been forensically analyzed, everything else, and they've never challenged it. 22,000 emails have been authenticated, but still people, there's a fake news circuit on the left too, but very much so. And we write about it, which is not very popular among that.
No, it's still true.
I lose friends.
Round hole. It's square peg, round hole, man.
Yeah, no.
The narrative doesn't fit. Just like the Stop the Steal crowd, right? Just like this whole, no matter how many things, look, is there election fraud in the United States? Yes. Is it a problem that private companies own these machines? Yes. Has it been demonstrated there have been problems before? Yes. Does that mean every claim then comes to the system's rigged? When people like Donald Trump start crowing about the rigging of the system, we need to be very careful about how they define the term and with what examples. Because if we want to go back to the inception of the republic, things have been rigged from the beginning. When women couldn't vote, people of color couldn't vote. You just take it. The system's been rigged. There's no question about that. But notice how that becomes a part of the narrative, that it's like these crazy QAnon cultist people think the elections are stolen. Well, guess what? On the other side of the spectrum, you've got a whole host of people in the liberal class that don't want to look at the problems of COVID response or lockdowns. They don't want to look at the problems of Hunter Biden's laptop and the way the Democratic Party suppressed the story. Forget about the laptop. It's what you just said, Richard. It's the willful, knowing suppression and censorship of information to benefit themselves at the expense of public knowledge that is among the most corrupt things we can call attention to in our society, and we need to do it no matter who's doing it. 20 ex-intelligence officials say Hunter Biden's laptop has all the earmarks of a Russian disinformation
complete
But
lie.
they gave
And by
no
the way,
evidence. They didn't give
while
any evidence.
and by the way, intelligence agency heads are the people you should be most skeptical
Yeah,
about.
right.
One of the chapters in your new collection, or one of the stories, the human mind as quote unquote new domain of war. NATO plans for cognitive warfare. These are the
Absolutely.
people you're going to trust. Repression of Palestinian media. Facebook's blacklist of dangerous individuals and organizations stifles public debate. We could go on and on and on. And Mickey, I'm sure we could, but unfortunately, we are, as every host has to say, sooner or later, out of time.
Mhm.
So I encourage people. My guest is Mickey Huff of Project Censored. Their latest publication is Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2023. I encourage people to read it. I thank you and your colleagues for preparing it. And thank you so much for coming on the program.
Richard, I can't thank you enough. And your listeners and viewers can go to projectcensored.org to find out more information. Appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for all your important work.
And you too. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.